When police officers stopped a black teen walking home at night, they assumed he was up to no good. They questioned him aggressively, treating him like a suspect rather than an innocent kid. But when the teen calmly handed over his father's diplomatic badge, everything changed. What happened next left the officers frozen in shock. This isn't just a story about a tense encounter. It's a lesson about assumptions, privilege, and the unexpected ways people's true identities can challenge prejudice. Stay tuned to find out how this dramatic moment unfolded. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more eye-opening stories like this one. It was a quiet evening in a peaceful neighborhood. 16-year-old Jamal Daniels was walking home after spending the evening at a friend's house, working on a school project. Jamal was a smart, respectful teenager with dreams of becoming a scientist. He carried a backpack filled with textbooks and his laptop, focused on getting home to finish his homework. The street was mostly empty, except for the glow of streetlights and the occasional passing car. Jamal wasn't worried. He had walked this route many times before. But tonight, as he turned the corner, he noticed a police car approaching slowly. Its headlights cut through the dimly lit street, making Jamal's heart race. Inside the car were two officers, Sergeant Miller and Officer Blake, who were on their usual patrol. When they saw Jamal walking alone with his hood up and carrying a backpack, they became suspicious. To them, he didn't look like he belonged in the neighborhood, and they decided to stop him. "Let's check this out," Miller said as he pulled the car to the side of the road. Blake nodded and grabbed his flashlight. The car came to a stop near Jamal, and the officers stepped out. Jamal paused, knowing what was about to happen. He remembered his parents' advice: stay calm, be polite, and don't argue. "Hey, kid," Miller called out, shining the flashlight in Jamal's face. "What are you doing out here?" Jamal shielded his eyes from the bright light, but stayed calm. "I'm just walking home, sir," he said politely. "I live nearby." Blake crossed his arms, looking doubtful. "Walking around at night? What's in the bag?" he asked sharply. "It's just my school stuff," Jamal replied, carefully unzipping the bag and showing its contents. Inside were notebooks, textbooks, and a laptop. Nothing unusual. The officers glanced at each other, their suspicion unshaken. "Got any ID on you?" Miller asked. "Yes, sir," Jamal said, reaching into his pocket to pull out his school ID. He handed it over, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Miller studied the ID but didn't look convinced. "Why are you out here this late? Don't you know you look suspicious walking around like this?" he asked. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Jamal replied calmly. "I'm just trying to get home." The officers didn't ease up. Their tone grew sharper as they continued questioning him, making Jamal feel like he was on trial for simply walking home. But he stayed calm, knowing that any sign of frustration could make things worse. Then, as the officers pressed him further, Jamal decided to pull something else from his pocket. It was a small, official badge, neatly encased. He held it out to Miller and said, "This is my dad's diplomatic badge. He's a diplomat with the embassy." Miller and Blake froze, their confident expressions replaced by confusion and surprise. Miller took the badge, examining it under the flashlight. It was unmistakably official, and the weight of what they had just done began to sink in. As Sergeant Miller held the diplomatic badge under the beam of his flashlight, the air grew heavy with tension. Officer Blake leaned closer to get a better look, his previously sharp expression softening into one of uncertainty. The badge was clearly official, embossed with the insignia of an embassy. It carried weight that neither of them could ignore. "What is this?" Miller asked, his voice less confident now. "It's my dad's diplomatic badge," Jamal repeated calmly, his tone steady, despite the pressure of the moment. He's a diplomat. You can call the embassy to confirm." The words hung in the air like a sudden storm, freezing the officers in place. They had assumed Jamal was just another kid who didn't belong in the neighborhood, but now they were faced with the possibility that they had made a huge mistake. Blake shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Miller. "Diplomatic immunity?" he whispered, as if the phrase carried some kind of magical power. Miller gave him a sharp look, but it was clear they were both scrambling to figure out what to do next. "What's your father's name?" Miller asked, his tone less accusatory and more cautious. "Ambassador Daniels," Jamal replied, meeting the officer's eyes. "He works with the embassy downtown." Miller felt a knot tightening in his stomach. He had heard the name before. Ambassador Daniels was a well-known figure in the diplomatic community, respected for his work and influence. The realization hit Miller like a cold wave. The teenager they had stopped wasn't just anyone. He was the son of someone with significant power and connections. Blake cleared his throat, trying to regain some composure. "Why didn't you say that earlier?" he asked, his tone defensive. Jamal tilted his head slightly. "Why should I have to?" he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just walking home." The officers exchanged another uneasy glance. Their earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a mix of regret and embarrassment. They knew they had crossed a line, and now they were trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. "All right," Miller said, handing the badge back to Jamal. "We're just doing our job. You can't blame us for being cautious." Jamal looked at him steadily, his composure unshaken. "Your job is to protect and serve," he said. "Not to judge people based on how they look or assume they're doing something wrong just because they're walking home at night." Blake opened his mouth to respond, but quickly closed it again, unable to come up with a defense. The truth in Jamal's words cut through the silence like a blade. The officers knew he was right, but admitting it felt like a blow to their pride. The tension was broken by the crackle of Miller's radio, a dispatcher's voice calling in a nearby incident. Miller reached for the radio and responded quickly, eager to shift the focus away from the awkward encounter. "All right," Miller said, turning back to Jamal. "You're free to go. Stay safe out there." Jamal nodded, but didn't move right away. He stood his ground, looking at the officers with quiet strength. "I hope this makes you think twice the next time you stop someone for no reason," he said. "Not everyone has a badge to protect them." Miller and Blake didn't respond. They stood there, watching, as Jamal adjusted his backpack and walked away, his steps steady and unhurried. The officers felt the weight of his words long after he disappeared into the night. Later that evening, Jamal arrived home and shared the encounter with his father, Ambassador Daniels. The ambassador listened carefully, his expression thoughtful, as Jamal recounted every detail. He wasn't surprised by what had happened. He knew all too well how often assumptions and bias led to unjust treatment. "I'm proud of you for staying calm," Ambassador Daniels said, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "But I need to address this." "What are you going to do?" Jamal asked. Ambassador Daniels gave a small, reassuring smile. "I'll make sure this becomes a teaching moment, for them and for others." The next morning, Miller and Blake were called into a meeting with their commanding officer. They assumed it was routine until they walked into the room and saw Ambassador Daniels sitting at the table. The ambassador's presence was enough to make them nervous, but his calm demeanor made the situation even more unsettling. "Officers," Ambassador Daniels began, his voice steady and firm, "I'm here to discuss the incident with my son last night." Miller and Blake exchanged a glance, unsure of what to say. The commanding officer gestured for them to sit, and they did so reluctantly. "I want to be clear," the ambassador continued. This isn't about revenge or making anyone feel bad. It's about accountability and learning. My son did nothing wrong, yet he was treated like a suspect because of assumptions you made." Miller cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Sir, we were just trying to be cautious. It's our job to investigate anything that seems suspicious." Ambassador Daniels nodded. "I understand that. But tell me, what was suspicious about a teenager walking home with a backpack? Was it the way he looked? The color of his skin?" The room fell silent. Miller and Blake had no response. "My son is lucky," the ambassador continued. "Lucky to have a badge that made you stop and think. But what about those who don't have that privilege? How often are they treated unfairly because of assumptions?" The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The ambassador's words hit harder than any formal reprimand could have. "I'm not here to ruin your careers," Ambassador Daniels said. "I'm here to challenge you to do better. Every person you encounter deserves respect and fairness. That's what your badge represents, and it's your responsibility to uphold that." Miller and Blake nodded, their earlier defensiveness replaced by regret. They knew they had made a mistake, and now they had to own it. The meeting room was silent as Ambassador Daniels finished speaking. Officers Miller and Blake sat stiffly in their chairs, their earlier confidence replaced by visible unease. The weight of the ambassador's words hung in the air, forcing them to confront their actions. "I appreciate that you were doing your job," Ambassador Daniels said, breaking the silence. "But doing your job doesn't mean making snap judgments based on someone's appearance. My son did nothing wrong, and yet he was treated as a suspect, simply because of how he looked." Miller cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Ambassador Daniels, we never meant to offend or harm your son," he said. "We were just trying to be cautious." "Cautious?" Daniels repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Caution is one thing, Sergeant Miller. Prejudice is another. Would you have stopped him if he didn't look the way he does? If he wasn't black, would you have assumed he was suspicious just for walking home?" Miller looked down at the table, unable to meet the ambassador's eyes. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing there was no justification for their actions. The ambassador's calm but firm tone left no room for excuses. "My son is lucky," Daniels continued. "Lucky that he had a badge to show you. Lucky that I hold a position that made you stop and think. But what about the teenagers who don't have that? What happens to them when your assumptions take over?" The question hit like a hammer. Both officers knew the answer but were too ashamed to say it aloud. The ambassador's words forced them to confront the harsh reality of their actions, not just from the previous night, but from countless other interactions they'd likely had in the past. "I'm not here to destroy your careers," Daniels said after a pause. "I'm here to ensure this becomes a learning experience for both of you. You wear a badge that symbolizes trust, responsibility, and fairness. But last night, you failed to honor what that badge stands for." Miller finally looked up, his voice quiet but sincere. "You're right, sir. We let our assumptions get the best of us, and we were wrong. I'm sorry for how we treated your son." Blake nodded in agreement, his face pale. "We didn't handle it the way we should have," he added. "We should have listened to him and treated him with the respect he deserved." Ambassador Daniels nodded slowly. "Acknowledging your mistake is the first step," he said. "But words mean nothing without action. What are you going to do to ensure this doesn't happen again?" The commanding officer, who had been silently observing the exchange, spoke up. "Ambassador Daniels, I can assure you that these officers will undergo additional training on bias and community relations. We take this very seriously." Daniels nodded, but kept his gaze on Miller and Blake. "Training is a start," he said, "but real change comes from within. It's up to you to examine your own biases and make a conscious effort to do better every day." Both officers nodded, their faces etched with regret. They had started the previous night with confidence in their authority, but now they understood how easily that authority could be misused. They realized the harm their actions had caused, not just to Jamal, but to the trust their badges were supposed to represent. Later that day, Miller and Blake met privately to discuss what had happened. The conversation was uncomfortable, but both officers knew they needed to face the truth. "We messed up," Miller admitted, running a hand through his hair. "We let our assumptions control how we treated that kid. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and we made him feel like a criminal." Blake nodded, his expression serious. "We've done this before, too," he said quietly. "How many people have we stopped just because they looked suspicious? How many times have we assumed the worst instead of giving someone the benefit of the doubt?" The question hung in the air, and neither of them had an answer. For the first time, they realized the full impact of their behavior, not just on the people they stopped, but on the integrity of their role as police officers. "We need to change," Miller said firmly. "Not just for ourselves, but for the people we're supposed to protect." Blake nodded. "Yeah, it's time we start doing the job the right way." Meanwhile, Jamal sat at home with his father, reflecting on the events of the night before. "Do you think they'll actually change?" he asked. "I hope so," Ambassador Daniels replied. "But whether they do or not, what matters is that you stood your ground with dignity. You showed them that their assumptions don't define who you are." Jamal nodded, feeling a sense of pride despite the difficult encounter. "Thanks for standing up for me, Dad," he said. "I hope this makes them think twice before they treat someone else the way they treated me." "It's not just about them," Daniels said. "It's about setting an example. For you, for them, and for anyone who hears this story. Change doesn't happen all at once, but every conversation like this pushes things in the right direction." The incident stayed with the officers long after their meeting with Ambassador Daniels. For Miller and Blake, the weight of their mistake was a constant reminder of how easily power could be misused. They realized that the boy they had stopped wasn't just the son of an influential diplomat. He was a teenager who deserved respect and fairness, just like anyone else. Back at the station, word of the encounter spread among the other officers. Some were defensive, dismissing it as an overreaction, while others began reflecting on their own behavior. The commanding officer decided it was time for change. He announced mandatory training sessions on recognizing and addressing bias, emphasizing that the station needed to rebuild trust with the community. Miller and Blake attended the first session reluctantly, unsure of what to expect. The facilitator, a community leader with years of experience, began the session with a simple but powerful statement. "Every person you encounter is carrying a story you can't see. Your job is not to assume. It's to protect and serve without prejudice." The words struck a chord with both officers. As the session continued, they listened to stories from community members who had experienced unfair treatment by law enforcement. The stories were raw and emotional, forcing Miller and Blake to confront the reality of how bias could harm the very people they were sworn to protect. One of the speakers at the session was Ambassador Daniels himself. He spoke not as an official, but as a father. "When you stopped my son," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you didn't see a teenager walking home from a friend's house. You saw a stereotype. And that assumption could have escalated into something far worse if my son hadn't remained calm, or if he hadn't had my badge." The room was silent as the officers absorbed his words. Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of the ambassador's statement hitting him harder than he expected. Blake, too, felt a deep sense of shame. They had stopped Jamal because of assumptions, not because of any real suspicion, and in doing so, they had betrayed the trust their badges represented. Meanwhile, Jamal tried to move on from the encounter. He poured his energy into school and his dream of becoming a scientist, but the incident lingered in the back of his mind. He couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if he didn't have the privilege of his father's position. One evening, as Jamal and Ambassador Daniel sat together, Jamal spoke up. "Dad, do you think what you said to them will really make a difference?" The ambassador looked at his son thoughtfully. "I can't say for sure," he admitted. "Change takes time, and it takes effort. But sometimes all it takes is one moment to plant a seed. I hope that's what happened with those officers." Jamal nodded, his father's words giving him hope. "I just wish people didn't have to prove they're worth respect," he said quietly. "It should be automatic." "You're right," Daniel said. "But every step we take toward that is progress. And you, Jamal, you're part of that progress. The way you handled yourself that night with grace and dignity, that's how change starts." Back at the station, Miller and Blake began making small but significant changes in how they approached their work. They took more time to assess situations, ensuring they weren't jumping to conclusions. They started listening more carefully to the people they interacted with, treating everyone with the respect they deserved. One day, while on patrol, Miller and Blake stopped at a local community center where a youth program was hosting a discussion about building trust with law enforcement. They decided to sit in, quietly listening to teenagers and young adults share their experiences. Many of the stories were difficult to hear, but they stayed until the end, knowing it was important to face the reality of their profession. At the end of the session, a teenager approached them. "You're the officers who stopped Jamal, right?" he asked. Miller nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "That was us." The teenager gave them a long look before saying, "Jamal said you apologized. He told me his dad talked to you too. I hope you're serious about changing, because we need it." Blake nodded, his voice steady. "We are," he said. "We messed up, but we're working on doing better. Thanks for giving us a chance." The teenager nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We'll be watching," he said before walking away. For Miller and Blake, the incident with Jamal became a turning point. It wasn't just about one mistake. It was about recognizing the need for growth and taking steps toward accountability. Their journey wasn't perfect, but they were committed to doing better. As for Jamal, he continued to excel in school, inspired by his father's wisdom and the strength he had shown during the encounter. He knew the world wasn't perfect, but he also knew that change was possible and that he had a role to play in making it happen. In the weeks following the encounter with Jamal, the atmosphere at the station began to change. The incident had sparked conversations among the officers about their roles and the biases they carried, even if they hadn't realized it before. For Miller and Blake, in particular, the event became a turning point in their careers. One morning, during a shift briefing, the commanding officer addressed the entire team. "We all know about what happened with Ambassador Daniel's son," he began, his tone firm but calm. "This is a reminder for all of us. We're here to serve and protect, not judge or profile. Our duty is to treat every person with respect, no exceptions." The officers nodded in agreement, though some still felt uncomfortable with the change. For Miller and Blake, however, the message hit home. They had already started making adjustments in their approach to policing. No longer did they view people through a lens of suspicion. Instead, they tried to see individuals as people with their own stories. Miller found himself thinking back to the moment Jamal handed over the diplomatic badge. The calm confidence with which Jamal had presented it contrasted sharply with the way he and Blake had treated him. That memory stayed with Miller, pushing him to reconsider his assumptions in every interaction he had going forward. One day, while on patrol, Miller encountered a young man fixing his car on the side of the road. In the past, Miller might have approached with suspicion, asking probing questions about what the man was doing there. This time, however, he pulled over and simply asked, "Need a hand?" The young man, startled at first, smiled and explained that his car battery had died. Miller offered to help jump-start the car, and the interaction ended with a handshake and a genuine "thank you." For Miller, it was a small moment, but it symbolized the kind of officer he was striving to become. Blake, on the other hand, began volunteering for community outreach programs organized by the station. He attended events at schools and community centers, where he had the chance to interact with teenagers like Jamal. Listening to their stories and concerns opened Blake's eyes to the fears and mistrust many young people had toward law enforcement. During one of these events, a teenager asked Blake directly, "Why do cops always assume we're up to something bad?" Blake paused, the question hitting him harder than he expected. "You're right," he said honestly. "We've made those mistakes, and I'm sorry for that. But I'm here to listen and to learn how we can do better." The teenager nodded, appreciating the sincerity in Blake's response. For Blake, the experience reinforced the importance of humility and accountability in his role as an officer. Meanwhile, Jamal continued to thrive in school, earning top grades and excelling in his science classes. The encounter with the police had left its mark on him, but rather than letting it discourage him, Jamal used the experience as a source of motivation. He began speaking at school assemblies and community events, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up for themselves with grace and dignity. During one of these events, Jamal said, "I could have let anger take over that night, but I didn't. I stayed calm because I wanted them to see who I really was, not who they assumed I was. And I hope that made them think twice before treating someone else the same way." His words resonated deeply with the audience, especially the teenagers who saw themselves in Jamal's story. Many approached him afterward, thanking him for his courage and asking how they could handle similar situations. Jamal realized that his voice could inspire change, and he embraced the role of a leader among his peers. Ambassador Daniels didn't stop with the conversation he had with Miller and Blake. He worked with the commanding officer to develop a long-term partnership between the police station and the local community. The program focused on building trust and understanding through regular dialogue, joint activities, and training sessions. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Daniels said during one of the program's meetings. "But every step we take together brings us closer to the kind of world we want to live in. A world where respect and fairness are the foundation of every interaction." The program became a model for other stations in the area, demonstrating how accountability and collaboration could lead to real progress. Months later, Jamal crossed paths with Miller and Blake during a community event. The officers approached him with humility, their expressions sincere. "Jamal," Miller said, "I just want to say thank you. What happened that night? It opened our eyes. We've made changes because of you." Blake nodded. "You taught us something we'll never forget. We're sorry for how we treated you, and we're committed to doing better." Jamal smiled, his voice calm and steady. "I appreciate that," he said. "I hope you keep that promise, not just for me, but for everyone you meet." As the event continued, Miller and Blake reflected on how far they had come since that fateful night. The encounter with Jamal had humbled them, forcing them to confront their biases and strive for change. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was one they were committed to continuing. For Jamal, the experience taught him the power of staying true to his values, even in the face of adversity. And for the officers, it was a reminder that respect and fairness should always guide their actions. The story of Jamal and the officers wasn't just about one incident. It was about growth, accountability, and the potential for change. It became a lesson for everyone who heard it, proving that even the most challenging moments can lead to something better. The story of Jamal Daniels and the police officers reminds us of an important lesson. Assumptions and bias can blind us to the truth, but accountability and change can transform even the most difficult situations. Jamal's calm strength and his father's wisdom turned what could have been a moment of injustice into an opportunity for growth and reflection. For the officers, the encounter was a wake-up call that pushed them to confront their biases and work toward becoming better representatives of the law. Their willingness to listen and learn showed that change is possible, even when mistakes are made. And for Jamal, the experience became a powerful reminder of his own resilience and the impact one person can have in challenging stereotypes. What about you? How do you handle situations where you're unfairly judged? Do you believe change is possible when people acknowledge their mistakes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful and thought-provoking stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with another story that will challenge your perspective and leave you inspired. Until then, take care and remember, change starts with understanding, and respect is the foundation of a better world.